realistic this may sound to you, but a colleague of mine, Edward Epp, at the University of Manitoba up in Winnipeg, runs a flood institute, and he has actually studied the communities along the Red River and shown that by purchasing farmland and converting them back to interconnected sets of wetlands, that you can handle all of the flood conditions that you will ever experience without ever having a flood in the city itself. What it does mean is that it means giving up some farmland and converting them back to wetlands. But what that also means is creating a lot of natural habitat, creating maybe one of the largest prairie and wetland parks in the country, and also protecting the city from flood. So in this principle is the idea that a city like Fargo and the Army Corps of Engineers have been dealing with flooding in the old mechanistic 20th century way of dealing with a problem. There's a flood, let's put up sandbags, let's build walls, let's channel it, let's keep it away. I would argue that's old thinking. First of all, we can't afford it. Secondly, it doesn't work because it doesn't work the way nature works. This is the way nature works. Nature handles flooding in its own way. We need to handle flooding the way nature handles flooding, and we'll be fine. It's cheaper, it's more effective, and you don't have to put your houses on stilts. So you learn from nature. One of the biggest movements in the design field is this idea called biomimicry. And we've been doing a lot of work with biologists at our university, just saying, tell us how nature does things. And it's incredible what nature does. I mean, this is a big tangent, but I get excited. So I'll just tell you one example. We've been fascinated that leaves never get dirty. Well, we discovered that the reason why leaves never get dirty is that they have this little serrated surface. And as water comes, it rolls up all the dirt and rolls right off a leaf when it rains. So we've been dealing with buildings and paint, and so buildings get dirty. So we said, well, we discovered that if you make a paint surface that has the little serrations like a leaf, buildings never get dirty either. And so it's cheaper, you never have to clean your building, and it just learns from nature. This is one example of thousands of these examples where, in fact, nature has already figured out how to do these things. And if we stop thinking that we're smarter than nature and better than nature, but just learn from it, we will discover that these things are cheap and easy and will, in fact, make our lives better. That's one of the biggest changes. Another change is break down the scale at which we try to deal with things. This is an aerial photo of the Dutch polders. And I use this in my book. I compare the Army Corps of Engineers' way of dealing with flooding, big levee systems, which of course we know from New Orleans was what I call a fracture critical system, right? There were a couple breaks in the levees. The entire city of New Orleans floods with a couple breaks. That is not smart. It's still the most expensive catastrophe in human history, Katrina. We can't afford to have these kind of catastrophes anymore. We can't afford to do things at a large scale with big federal government investments. Heaven knows. I mean, who knows if the federal government even can find a way to function anymore. What the Dutch have done is to say that we don't care about the federal government. Every community in Holland builds their own levees. They each do it their own way. The kids in school learn how to fix the levees. They use local materials to repair the levees. And they have divided the countries up into thousands of what they call polders. So that if there is a break in one of their levees, only a small part of the country gets flooded. And I use that as a metaphor for how we have to move forward in the future about infrastructure. We have to stop thinking about large-scale, national, extremely expensive systems and think about the fact that infrastructure is now going to increasingly need to be locally controlled, locally managed, and using local materials, local expertise, and local communities taking responsibility for it. Again, this is something that Fargo has a lot of great experience with. You're incredible. Every year you're on national news for how you deal with this. And I think that's an advantage. But I would encourage you to think beyond just stopping the Red River from flooding. Take the incredible social capital that you've built dealing with the Red River and apply that to everything you do, because that is the way to thrive in the future. Increase the density of the city and take advantage of where you're at. I mean, this is an aerial view of Stockholm, but it could be Fargo too, which is, in a way, what I like about this image is don't try to keep the water out, let the water in. Don't try to sprawl out and be like every other city. Maybe Fargo, given its landscape and its location, you need to think about things differently. Maybe you need to be denser in places and let other parts of the city flood. I mean, maybe that's okay. The reason why density is so important, and I'll get to this later, is that the most important issue for a city like Fargo in the future is innovation. And innovation happens when people interact. And the problem with sprawl is not that it's, takes a lot of gas to drive out to the suburbs or whatever. It just is that it keeps us apart. So whatever you do as a city, you need to find ways to create reasons for people to come together. This is why cities existed, and this is why they exist, and this is where innovations occur, and this is why cities thrive. And so your city will thrive the more you find reasons to come together, and a certain degree of density is part of that. Although, I talked about buildings on stilts, I do think there are also opportunities in your comp plan to think about incentivizing property owners to do things differently. I think one of the other things about the world we're in is to encourage creativity, encourage people to sort of try new things, pilot new things. And we tend to have regulations, zoning regulations, building codes that stifle creativity. And in fact, I think where we need to go is to say, if somebody wants to, or a community, a neighborhood, or maybe a property owner wants to try something for a reason, we, instead of saying, no, you can't do that, it's not in our code, is to say, we're going to create a pilot, and we're going to monitor this, and we're going to see whether this works. And if it doesn't work, you may have to go back and apply and meet the code, but maybe not. Maybe you'll come up with something new. And so a city that encourages creativity among its residents is a city that will come to the new ideas first. Again, this density issue, and again, part of this is social capital. One of the things that we've been looking at in our college, and we've been doing some experiments down in the Twin Cities, is to recognize that a lot of the political debate right now is about, money. We don't have enough money. We either have to raise taxes or cut spending, right? All of that is focused on financial capital. And we don't recognize that the real wealth in a community is social capital. It's people. And it's their ideas, their energy, their knowledge. We have so underexploited and underutilized the social capital of people in our communities that this is part of the transformation that's going on. So, for example, we're doing a pilot in the Twin Cities where there's a community that's been dealing with this debate about raising taxes or cutting spending, and we said, okay, why don't you try an experiment where the taxes will be on a sliding scale. And so if you give some of your time and your knowledge, your taxes go down. And in fact, if you give a lot of your time and your knowledge, you won't pay any taxes. And if you don't want to give any of your time or your knowledge to the community, your taxes will go up. And you have a choice. Taxes are not a fixed thing. They're a negotiated thing, depending about how much of your social capital you want to give to your community as opposed to your financial capital. And everybody may have a different formula. So this is a way, for example, to utilize all of this incredible talent that's unemployed and underemployed right now. Instead of having people sitting home being depressed, wanting jobs and not being able to get them, let's put them all to work. Let's utilize all of that social capital and incentivize them to give back to their communities, give them purpose, give them meaning, enable communities to do much more with less. And stop polarizing the sort of tax debate and recognize where real value lies, which is in its people, not in money. Part of this is encouraging communities to create and care for their own infrastructure. Again, one of the things that happened as a sort of a legacy of the 20th century and of this old mechanistic model in which cities were thought of is the idea that somebody else takes care of our infrastructure. The utilities, I pay my taxes, the city takes care of that. It's not my problem. Well, increasingly, communities need to think about infrastructure as something that they create, maintain, and care for. And infrastructure, like everything else, is going to become radically decentralized, as it always has been for human communities. And so finding ways for neighborhoods, for communities, for even block-by-block kinds of infrastructure is part of where we are going to be. The other piece of this is this notion of participation. I think one of the great things about Go2030 is the level of, and the amount of participation of this community. I think that what is more important for Fargo than to have a plan is to have this process continue. I think you would be better off not just sort of going through this for a little bit and having a plan and okay, we did our plan and we'll all forget about it. The best thing about this is the fact that you have people participating, putting forward ideas. There's all sorts of great comments on this website of people arguing, and I think that is how you build community. So part of this is to see planning as an ongoing participatory process. And it's building this web of relationships and connections. And I think that what you could begin to do from this website is to start to connect people who agree. I mean, this is the other thing, is to recognize that there's all these like sub-communities within Fargo and people who are sort of, in alignment. Well, the city could help get those people together. And maybe that group wants to work on something. Great, let them do it. This is the way in which we will plan and develop cities in the future. Is all this energy, don't stop it. Keep going. I would keep going to 2030. Why not? This process is actually how you're going to make Fargo. Not some plan that's in a book and we all forget about. And so this idea of creating opportunities for that is important. This idea of emphasizing neighborhoods and at a scale in which people can contribute. This is a kind of a wacky image from Denmark, but and I don't recommend this necessarily as something for Fargo to do, but what it says is Denmark, which by the way, Dan Buettner's research shows is one of the happiest, healthiest countries in the world, is that they are intensely social and intensely neighborhood oriented. And the way in which they develop kind of says that. While this might be a kind of extreme example of that, I think you would need to recognize that the unit here isn't the city. One of the things that's going to be true about the 20th century is nations will become almost completely irrelevant. I mean, the total stagnation at our federal level, at our federal government, shows that nations no longer work. The nation state may, in fact, be this kind of remnant of the old way of thinking. States may not be very relevant either, because one of the things I know you find here in Fargo and we find in the Twin Cities is there's this tension with the state, right? I mean, you've got all this kind of great energy and activity along the Red River, universities, and I know you've got the western part of your state, which doesn't always see things in the same way. We have the same problem in Minnesota. We said, well, who cares about the state? I mean, it's just an arbitrary thing. What really matters are city-based regions. They will increasingly become the economic unit of the future. They will be competing with each other.